Captain Sarah Mitchell had been flying helicopters for 12 years, but nothing prepared her for what happened on that October morning. The sun was just breaking through the clouds when her radio crackled with an urgent message. A medical evacuation was needed in the disputed border region between two hostile nations. A UN peacekeeping team had been ambushed, and several soldiers needed immediate medical attention. Sarah checked her fuel gauge and flight path one more time. The area they were heading to was known as the neutral zone, a stretch of rocky terrain that neither country officially claimed, but both sides patrolled heavily. It was dangerous territory, but Sarah had made similar flights before. Her helicopter was equipped with medical supplies and could carry up to 6 wounded soldiers. As her helicopter lifted off from the base, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with every dangerous mission. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant James Parker, was checking the navigation systems while the medic, Sergeant Lisa Chen, organized the medical equipment in the back. They had worked together many times before and trusted each other completely. The flight to the neutral zone took 45 minutes. Below them, the landscape changed from green valleys to brown rocky hills dotted with small villages. Sarah could see smoke rising from several locations, signs of the ongoing conflict that had been raging for months. Her helicopter stayed at a safe altitude, but she knew that once they landed, they would be vulnerable to attack from either side. When they reached the coordinates, Sarah saw the UN convoy scattered across a narrow valley. 3 vehicles had been destroyed and she could see bodies lying on the ground. Some soldiers were waving frantically at the helicopter, pointing to wounded comrades who needed immediate help. Sarah found a flat area about 200 meters from the convoy and began her descent. The landing was smooth, but as soon as the helicopter touched down, everything went wrong. Enemy forces had been waiting for the rescue attempt. Gunfire erupted from the hills surrounding the valley, and Sarah heard bullets hitting the side of her aircraft. The wounded UN soldiers who were trying to reach the helicopter had to take cover behind rocks and destroyed vehicles. Lieutenant Parker was shouting into his radio, trying to contact their base for backup support, but all he got was static. Something was jamming their communications. Sarah kept the engine running, ready to take off at a moment's notice, but she couldn't leave without the wounded soldiers. Through her headset, she could hear Sergeant Chen coordinating with the UN medics on the ground, trying to figure out how to get the wounded men to safety. The gunfire intensified and Sarah realized they were surrounded. Enemy soldiers were moving down from the hills, using the rocky terrain for cover as they advanced toward the landing zone. She had to make a quick decision. If they stayed much longer, her helicopter would be destroyed and everyone would be killed or captured. But if they left now, the wounded soldiers would die. Sarah made her choice. She told Parker and Chen to prepare for an emergency takeoff with whatever wounded they could get aboard quickly. 2 severely injured UN soldiers were carried to the helicopter by their comrades, who then ran back toward the rocks for cover. As soon as the wounded men were secured inside, Sarah pulled up on the controls and the helicopter began to rise, but they were too late. A rocket-propelled grenade fired from the hillside struck the helicopter's tail rotor just as they were gaining altitude. The aircraft spun violently and began falling back toward the ground. Sarah fought with the controls, trying to auto-rotate and find a safe place to crash land, but the helicopter was too damaged to control properly. The helicopter hit the ground hard, sliding across the rocky surface before coming to rest against a large boulder. Sarah's head struck the instrument panel and she felt blood running down her face. Parker was unconscious, slumped over his controls with a deep gash on his forehead. In the back, Sergeant Chen was trying to check on the wounded soldiers while dealing with her own injuries. Sarah quickly assessed their situation. The helicopter was destroyed and would never fly again. Their radio was completely dead, smashed in the crash. They were stranded in hostile territory with limited supplies and wounded men who needed medical attention. The enemy soldiers would be searching for survivors, and their position was completely exposed. Working quickly despite her injuries, Sarah helped Chen move the wounded soldiers away from the wreckage to a small cluster of rocks that offered some protection. Parker regained consciousness but was clearly suffering from a severe concussion. The 2 wounded UN soldiers they had rescued were in critical condition and needed surgery that Chen couldn't provide with the limited medical supplies they had salvaged from the IM helicopter. As the sun began to set, Sarah realized the full extent of their predicament. They were stranded in the neutral zone without any way to communicate with their base. Enemy patrols would be looking for them, and they had no idea when or if rescue would come. The wounded soldiers were getting worse, and their small group had very little food and water. Sarah gathered everyone together and explained their situation honestly. They would have to find a way to survive until help arrived, which could be days or even weeks. She divided their supplies carefully, making sure everyone had some water and food. Chen worked through the night, doing everything she could to keep the wounded soldiers alive with the limited medical supplies they had. During the long, cold night, Sarah took the first watch while the others tried to rest. She could hear vehicles moving in the distance and see lights sweeping across the valley as enemy forces searched for survivors. Every sound made her heart race, knowing that discovery would mean capture or death for all of them. As dawn approached, Sarah knew their real test was just beginning. They were alone in one of the most dangerous places on Earth, with no way to call for help and enemies hunting them, but she was determined to keep her team alive and get the wounded soldiers the medical care they desperately needed. She had no idea that it would be 12 days before SEAL forces would finally locate them, or what incredible challenges they would face during those 12 days of survival in the neutral zone. The second day in the neutral zone began with the sound of helicopters in the distance. Sarah's heart leaped with hope until she realized the aircraft were flying in a search pattern that was moving away from their location. These weren't rescue helicopters looking for survivors. They were enemy aircraft hunting for any signs of the downed crew. Sarah quickly gathered her small group deeper into the rocky outcropping where they had taken shelter. The two wounded UN soldiers, Corporal Anderson and Private Martinez, were barely conscious despite Sergeant Chen's continuous medical care throughout the night. Lieutenant Parker's concussion was severe, and he was having trouble staying focused for more than a few minutes at a time. The reality of their situation was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Their helicopter crash had occurred in a section of the neutral zone that was particularly remote and difficult to access. The rocky terrain that provided them with hiding places also made it nearly impossible for rescue forces to locate them without specific coordinates. Their emergency beacon had been destroyed in the crash, and their radio equipment was completely useless. Sarah knew that their survival depended on staying hidden while somehow signaling their location to friendly forces. But every attempt to create a visible signal would also alert enemy patrols to their presence. She had to find a way to balance the need for rescue with the need to avoid capture. During the morning hours, Sarah conducted a careful inventory of their supplies. They had managed to salvage 2 emergency ration packs from the helicopter, along with 4 bottles of water and a basic first aid kit that Chen had supplemented with medical supplies from the aircraft. At their current consumption rate, they had enough food for perhaps 3 days and water for 2 days if they were very careful. The biggest immediate problem was water. The rocky terrain around their hiding spot was completely dry, and Sarah hadn't seen any signs of natural water sources in the area. She would have to venture away from their safe position to search for water, which meant exposing herself to enemy patrols and potentially getting lost in the unfamiliar landscape. Chen continued working with the wounded soldiers, but her supplies were running dangerously low. Corporal Anderson had a severe abdominal wound that was showing signs of infection, and Private Martinez had suffered significant blood loss from shrapnel wounds in his legs. Without proper surgical facilities and antibiotics, both men would die within days. Around midday, Sarah heard the sound of vehicles approaching their area. She signaled for complete silence and carefully moved to a position where she could observe the valley below their hiding spot. A convoy of enemy military trucks was conducting a systematic search of the crash site and surrounding area. Soldiers were spreading out in teams, checking every rock formation and potential hiding place. Sarah watched as the enemy soldiers examined the wreckage of her helicopter, removing equipment and documents. She felt a surge of anger seeing them go through her aircraft, but she forced herself to remain calm and focused on keeping her team safe. The search teams were thorough and professional, which meant they would eventually work their way up to the rocky area where her group was hiding. As the afternoon wore on, the enemy search teams moved closer to their position. Sarah had to make several quick decisions about moving the wounded soldiers to stay ahead of the advancing searchers. Each move was extremely difficult because both Anderson and Martinez were barely able to walk, and Parker's concussion made him unsteady and confused. The stress of constantly moving while trying to remain hidden was taking a toll on everyone. Chen was exhausted from providing medical care while helping to carry supplies and support the wounded soldiers. Sarah herself was operating on pure adrenaline, knowing that any mistake could result in the death or capture of her entire team. Late in the afternoon, Sarah made a critical discovery. While scouting ahead for their next hiding position, she found a small cave system carved into the rocky hillside. The caves were narrow and difficult to access, but they offered much better protection than the exposed rock formations they had been using. More importantly, one of the deeper caves had a small seepage of water trickling down the back wall. Moving everyone to the caves required extreme care and took several hours. Anderson and Martinez had to be practically carried by Sarah and Chen, while Parker struggled to navigate the narrow passages with his impaired balance and coordination. But by evening, they were safely hidden in a location that would be very difficult for enemy forces to discover. The cave system also provided an unexpected advantage. Sarah discovered that sounds from the valley below were amplified and echoed through the rock formations, allowing her to monitor enemy movements without exposing herself. She could hear vehicle engines, radio communications, and conversations between search teams, giving her advance warning when danger was approaching. That night, Sarah established a watch schedule that would allow everyone to get some rest while maintaining security. She took the first watch herself, listening to the sounds from below and planning their next moves. The water seepage in the cave was minimal, but it was clean and would help extend their survival time significantly. Chen managed to stabilize both wounded soldiers using the cave's shelter and the small amount of additional medical supplies she had found in her pack. Anderson's fever was concerning, but the infection didn't seem to be spreading as rapidly as she had feared. Martinez was weak from blood loss but appeared to be holding steady. As Sarah sat in the darkness of the cave keeping watch while her team rested, she thought about the rescue efforts that must be underway. Their base would have declared them missing when they failed to return from the mission. Search and rescue teams would be looking for them, but finding a small group hidden in the vast expanse of the neutral zone would be like finding a needle in a haystack. She knew that their best chance of rescue would come if they could somehow signal their location to friendly aircraft without alerting enemy forces. But creating any kind of visible signal during daylight would bring immediate enemy response, and signaling at night risked being seen by enemy patrols equipped with night vision equipment. The third day would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. Their food supplies were dwindling rapidly, and both wounded soldiers needed medical attention that was beyond Chen's capabilities with their limited supplies. Sarah would have to venture out of their safe hiding place to search for additional resources, knowing that each trip away from the caves increased the risk of discovery and capture. But for now, they were alive and hidden from their enemies. Sarah settled in for a long night of listening and planning, determined to keep her team safe until rescue could reach them in their rocky sanctuary, deep in the hostile territory of the neutral zone. By the fourth day, Sarah knew they were fighting a losing battle against time and circumstances. The cave system had provided excellent concealment, but their supplies were nearly exhausted, and both wounded soldiers were getting worse despite Chen's heroic medical efforts. Anderson's infection had spread, causing high fever and delirium, while Martinez was showing signs of internal bleeding that couldn't be treated. With their basic first aid supplies, Sarah made the difficult decision to leave the safety of the caves and venture into the surrounding area to search for food, additional water sources, and anything else that might help them survive. She knew the risks were enormous, but staying hidden in the caves would only delay the inevitable if she couldn't find additional resources. Before dawn, Sarah carefully planned her scouting mission. She would move during the early morning hours when enemy patrols were less likely to be active, and she would stay within a 2-hour walking distance of the caves, so she could return quickly if necessary. Chen would remain with the wounded soldiers and continue providing medical care, while Parker, whose concussion symptoms were slowly improving, would keep watch from the cave entrance. The landscape outside their rocky sanctuary was harsh and unforgiving. Sarah moved carefully across the broken terrain, staying low and using natural cover to avoid being spotted. The area showed clear signs of the ongoing conflict, with abandoned military equipment, destroyed vehicles, and shell craters scattered across the valley floor. After an hour of careful searching, Sarah made her first significant discovery. Hidden in a ravine about a mile from their caves, she found the remains of a UN supply convoy that had been attacked weeks earlier. Most of the vehicles had been stripped of anything valuable, but Sarah managed to find several bottles of water that had been overlooked, along with some emergency rations and a small medical kit that had fallen behind one of the damaged trucks. More importantly, she discovered a portable radio that appeared to be functional. The radio had been damaged in the attack, but Sarah's technical training allowed her to identify the problem and make temporary repairs using wire and components from other destroyed equipment. The radio was designed for short-range communication only, but it might be enough to contact friendly forces if any were operating in the area. The return trip to the caves was more dangerous than her outbound journey. Enemy patrols had become more active as the day progressed, and Sarah had to take several lengthy detours to avoid being spotted. She could hear helicopter searches in the distance and saw vehicle convoys moving along the main routes through the valley. The enemy was clearly determined to find any survivors from the helicopter crash. When Sarah finally reached the caves, she found Chen struggling to keep both wounded soldiers alive. Anderson's condition had deteriorated significantly during her absence, and Martinez was barely conscious. Parker was alert and keeping watch, but his headaches and dizziness were still severe enough to limit his effectiveness as a guard. Sarah immediately shared the supplies she had found, giving Chen access to additional medical materials and distributing the water and food carefully among the group. The extra supplies would extend their survival time by perhaps 2 or 3 days. But it was clear that both wounded soldiers needed surgical intervention soon, or they would not survive much longer. That evening, Sarah attempted to use the repaired radio to contact friendly forces. She tried various frequencies and broadcast brief emergency messages, but received no response. The radio's limited range and the mountainous terrain were making communication nearly impossible. However, she decided to continue trying at regular intervals, hoping that a patrol or aircraft might eventually come within range. The 5th day brought a new crisis that tested Sarah's leadership and decision-making abilities. During the early morning hours, Anderson's condition became critical. His fever spiked dangerously high, and he began experiencing seizures from the advanced infection. Chen worked frantically to stabilize him, but with their limited medical supplies, there was little she could do beyond basic supportive care. Sarah was faced with an impossible choice. Anderson needed immediate evacuation to a surgical facility, but any attempt to signal for emergency medical evacuation would reveal their location to enemy forces. If they were captured, not only would Anderson likely die anyway, but the entire team would be killed or taken prisoner. After consulting with Chen and weighing all the options, Sarah made the agonizing decision to focus their limited medical resources on Martinez, who had a better chance of survival, while keeping Anderson as comfortable as possible. It was a decision that would haunt her for years afterward, but she knew that trying to save one soldier at the cost of the entire team was not a risk she could justify. The sound of approaching aircraft that afternoon initially filled Sarah with hope, until she realized they were enemy helicopters conducting another systematic search of the area. This time, the search was more thorough and organized than previous efforts. The helicopters were working in coordination with ground teams, and they were checking areas that had been overlooked in earlier searches. Sarah ordered everyone deeper into the cave system as the helicopters passed overhead. The sound of rotor blades echoed through the rocky passages, and Sarah could hear the aircraft hovering directly above their hiding place for several terrifying minutes. The pilots were clearly suspicious of the area, but the cave entrances were well concealed and the helicopters eventually moved on to search other locations. That night, Anderson's condition worsened further, and Sarah knew he wouldn't survive another day without proper medical treatment. She continued trying to raise friendly forces on the radio, but the responses were only static and interference. The isolation and helplessness of their situation was beginning to affect everyone's morale, and Sarah had to work constantly to keep the team focused on survival rather than dwelling on their desperate circumstances. Martinez, meanwhile, seemed to be stabilizing slightly under Chen's care. His bleeding had slowed, and while he was still very weak, he was conscious and able to communicate. Parker's concussion symptoms continued to improve gradually, and he was becoming more helpful with security duties and basic camp maintenance. On the 6th day, Sarah made another dangerous foraging expedition to search for additional supplies and potential signaling opportunities. This time, she discovered something that changed their entire survival strategy. Hidden in a destroyed observation post on a nearby hilltop, she found a cache of signal flares and emergency equipment that had been left behind by retreating forces. The signal flares presented both an opportunity and a tremendous risk. Used correctly, they could alert friendly rescue forces to their exact location. But they would also immediately attract every enemy patrol in the area, potentially leading to a firefight that her wounded and weakened team couldn't survive. Sarah spent hours studying the terrain and enemy patrol patterns, trying to develop a plan that would maximize their chances of rescue while minimizing the risk of enemy response. She knew they were running out of time and Anderson was clearly dying despite Chen's best efforts. Soon, she would have to make a decision that would determine whether her team lived or died in the hostile wilderness of the neutral zone. The pieces were falling into place for a desperate gamble that would either bring salvation or destruction to her small band of survivors. The seventh day marked a turning point in their desperate struggle for survival. Anderson had died during the night, and the loss hit everyone hard. Chen blamed herself for not being able to save him, while Parker struggled with guilt over not being able to help more due to his ongoing concussion symptoms. Sarah felt the weight of command more heavily than ever, knowing that every decision she made could mean life or death for the remaining members of her team. They buried Anderson in a shallow grave among the rocks near their cave shelter, marking the location with a small cairn that could be found by recovery teams later. It was a simple ceremony, but it gave everyone a chance to process their grief and refocus on the challenge of keeping the remaining team members alive. Martinez's condition had stabilized somewhat, but he was still far too weak to travel any significant distance. Chen estimated that he needed at least another week of rest and medical care before he could attempt any kind of evacuation, but their supplies wouldn't last nearly that long. They were down to their last emergency rations and had only enough water for 2 more days. Sarah knew that their window for rescue was closing rapidly. The signal flares she had discovered offered their best chance of attracting friendly forces, but timing would be critical. She spent the morning developing a detailed plan that would maximize their chances of rescue, while minimizing the risk of enemy capture. The plan was complex and dangerous. Sarah would use the portable radio to monitor enemy communications and identify a time when their patrols were at maximum distance from the cave area. She would then move to the highest point in the immediate area and fire multiple signal flares in a pattern that would be visible to friendly aircraft, but might be mistaken for combat activity by enemy ground forces. The key to success would be timing and communication. Sarah had been monitoring radio frequencies and had identified what appeared to be the scheduling pattern for friendly reconnaissance flights over the neutral zone. If she could time the signal flares to coincide with a friendly aircraft overflight, they might be rescued before enemy forces could respond to the signals. Chen would remain with Martinez in the caves, ready to move quickly if rescue arrived or to evacuate deeper into the cave system if enemy forces discovered their location. Parker, whose condition had improved enough for him to be mobile, would position himself halfway between Sarah's signaling position and the caves, serving as a communication relay and early warning system. The weather that morning was perfect for the rescue attempt. Clear skies would make the signal flares visible from a great distance, and light winds would help the smoke plumes rise straight up, rather than being blown away. Sarah checked and rechecked her equipment, knowing that they would only get one chance to make the plan work. At midday, Sarah heard radio chatter indicating that a friendly reconnaissance aircraft was beginning its patrol route in their sector. She had approximately 30 minutes before the aircraft would be in position to see signals from their area. Sarah moved quickly to her predetermined signaling position, a rocky outcrop that provided good visibility in all directions, while offering some protection from ground-based enemy observation. The waiting was agonizing. Sarah could hear the distant sound of the aircraft engines getting closer, but she also noticed increased radio activity from enemy forces in the area. It seemed that enemy commanders had also detected the friendly aircraft and were positioning their units to intercept or avoid contact. Sarah realized that her signal flares might be seen by both friendly and enemy forces simultaneously. When the reconnaissance aircraft came within visual range, Sarah made her decision. She fired the first signal flare straight up, creating a bright red streak against the blue sky. The flare exploded into a brilliant red star that hung in the air for several seconds, before beginning to drift down, Sarah immediately fired 2 more flares in quick succession, creating a distinctive pattern that should be recognizable as a distress signal rather than combat activity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The reconnaissance aircraft changed course and began circling toward their location, but Sarah could also hear vehicle engines starting up in the valley below, and radio communications intensifying as enemy forces responded to the signal. She had successfully attracted attention, but now it was a race to see who would reach them first. Sarah quickly moved back toward the caves, using Parker's position as a relay point to coordinate with Chen and Martinez. The friendly aircraft was definitely responding to their signals and appeared to be calling for additional support. But enemy ground forces were also mobilizing rapidly and moving toward their general area. Within 20 minutes of the signal flares, Sarah could hear helicopters approaching from multiple directions. Some were clearly friendly aircraft responding to the distress signals, but others had the distinctive sound signature of enemy helicopters that were likely carrying armed response teams. The situation was developing into exactly the kind of race against time that Sarah had hoped to avoid. Chen had Martinez ready for immediate evacuation, with all their remaining supplies packed and ready to move. Parker was monitoring the approaches to their cave system and reporting on enemy movements. The friendly aircraft were getting closer, but so were the enemy ground forces, and Sarah could see dust clouds in the valley indicating multiple vehicle convoys converging on their area. The first friendly helicopter to arrive was a reconnaissance aircraft that couldn't land in the rocky terrain but could provide overhead surveillance and communication relay. The pilot immediately began coordinating with Sarah using the repaired radio, confirming their exact position and calling for appropriate rescue aircraft with the capability to extract them from the difficult terrain. But the enemy forces were also closing in rapidly. Sarah could see soldiers dismounting from vehicles in the valley below and beginning to climb toward the rocky area where they were hidden. The enemy commanders had correctly identified the general area where the signal flares had originated, and they were conducting a systematic search that would eventually lead them to the cave system. The race for survival had entered its final phase. Rescue helicopters were en route and would arrive within minutes, but enemy soldiers were also approaching and would reach their position at approximately the same time. Sarah would have to hold her ground and protect her wounded teammate until the rescue forces could extract them, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether their week-long survival ordeal would end in rescue or capture. Everything they had endured during their time in the neutral zone had led to this critical moment when survival would depend on timing, courage, and the skill of the rescue forces racing to reach them before their enemies could close the trap that was tightening around their rocky sanctuary. The sound of approaching rescue helicopters grew louder, but so did the voices of enemy soldiers climbing through the rocks below their cave system. Sarah positioned herself at the cave entrance with the only weapon they had managed to salvage from their helicopter crash, a service pistol with 2 magazines of ammunition. She knew that if enemy forces reached their position before the rescue helicopters could extract them, their chances of survival would be almost zero. Chen was working frantically to prepare Martinez for immediate evacuation. Despite his improved condition, he was still too weak to walk unassisted and would need to be carried to any rescue aircraft. Parker, his head injury finally allowing him to think clearly again, had positioned himself to help with Martinez while watching for enemy soldiers who might approach the cave from unexpected directions. The radio crackled with urgent communications between the rescue aircraft and their base. Sarah could hear the helicopter pilots coordinating their approach and discussing the tactical situation. Enemy forces had been detected throughout the area, and the rescue would have to be conducted under hostile fire. The pilots were requesting immediate air support to suppress enemy positions during the extraction. Sarah looked out from the cave entrance and saw the first enemy soldiers reaching the lower levels of their rocky hideout. The soldiers were moving carefully, checking each potential hiding place as they worked their way up toward the cave system. She estimated that they had perhaps 5 minutes before the enemy troops would discover the cave entrances and force a direct confrontation. The rescue helicopters appeared over the ridgeline, flying fast and low to avoid enemy fire from the valley below. Sarah could see that there were 2 aircraft, one configured for medical evacuation and another that appeared to be a gunship providing escort protection. The helicopters immediately came under fire from enemy positions, and Sarah watched tracer rounds streaking across the sky as the aircraft maneuvered to avoid the ground-based weapons. The Kyo medical evacuation helicopter began searching for a suitable landing zone near the cave system, but the rocky terrain made it impossible to land close to their position. The pilot's voice came over the radio, explaining that they would have to rappel down to extract the survivors, or Sarah's team would have to move to a more open area where the helicopter could land safely. Moving Martinez to an open landing zone would expose them to enemy fire and take time they didn't have. Sarah made the decision to request a rappel extraction, knowing that it would be more dangerous for the rescue crew but offered their best chance of getting everyone out alive. She gave the helicopter pilot their exact coordinates and began preparing Martinez for what would be a difficult and dangerous evacuation. The enemy soldiers were getting closer. Sarah could hear their voices echoing through the rock formations as they communicated with each other and coordinated their search. She positioned herself where she could see the main approach to their cave while still being able to help with the evacuation. When the rescue helicopter arrived, the escort gunship began attacking enemy positions in the valley, trying to suppress the ground fire that was targeting the medical helicopter. The sound of cannon fire and rocket explosions echoed across the rocky landscape as the gunship worked to clear a path for the evacuation. Enemy forces responded with increased intensity, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple locations as the firefight escalated. The medical helicopter moved into position directly above their cave system and began lowering rescue personnel on ropes. Sarah could see two figures in military uniforms descending toward their position, carrying additional medical equipment and evacuation gear. The helicopter crew was clearly experienced and professional, but they were operating in extremely dangerous conditions with enemy soldiers approaching from multiple directions. Just as the rescue team reached the ground near their cave entrance, the first enemy soldiers appeared among the rocks about 50 meters below their position. Sarah aimed her pistol and fired warning shots to discourage their advance, while shouting to Parker and Chen that the enemy had found them. The rescue team immediately took defensive positions and began returning fire with more effective weapons. Chen quickly briefed the rescue medics on Martinez's condition while they prepared him for the rope evacuation. The medical team had brought a special harness system that would allow them to lift Martinez safely despite his injuries, but the process would take several minutes to complete properly. During those critical minutes, Sarah and the rescue team would have to hold off the advancing enemy soldiers. The gunfight intensified as more enemy troops reached the rocky area around the cave system. The rescue team had better training and equipment, but they were outnumbered and fighting from an exposed position. The escort gunship continued providing fire support, but the rocky terrain limited its effectiveness, and the enemy soldiers were using the natural cover skillfully. Parker, despite his ongoing recovery from the concussion, proved to be an effective fighter. He had found additional ammunition in the rescue team's equipment and was helping to cover one of the approaches to their position. Chen finished her medical preparations and took up a defensive position, while the rescue medics worked to secure Martinez in the evacuation harness. The enemy soldiers made several attempts to rush their position, but were driven back each time by coordinated fire from the defenders. However, Sarah could see that the enemy forces were trying to surround their position and would eventually succeed if the evacuation took much longer. The rescue helicopter was running low on fuel and would have to leave soon regardless of whether the extraction was complete. The rescue team leader made the decision to begin the evacuation immediately, even though Martinez wasn't fully secured in the optimal position. They began lifting him toward the helicopter while continuing to fight off the enemy attack. Parker would go up next, followed by Chen, with Sarah and the rescue team providing cover until everyone else was safely aboard the aircraft. As Martinez was pulled up toward the rescue helicopter, enemy soldiers made their most determined assault on the cave position. Sarah found herself in a desperate firefight, using her last magazine of ammunition to help the rescue team hold their defensive line. The sound of gunfire was constant, and bullets were hitting the rocks around their position regularly. The extraction was succeeding, but it was going to be very close. Enemy reinforcements were arriving in the valley below, and the rescue helicopter was taking increasing amounts of ground fire. Sarah knew that within minutes, their position would be overrun or the rescue helicopter would be forced to withdraw to avoid being shot down. Everything depended on the next few critical minutes as the evacuation continued under increasingly desperate circumstances. In the rocky wilderness of the neutral zone, The sound of approaching rescue helicopters grew louder, but so did the voices of enemy soldiers climbing through the rocks below their cave system. Sarah positioned herself at the cave entrance with the only weapon they had managed to salvage from their helicopter crash, a service pistol with 2 magazines of ammunition. She knew that if enemy forces reached their position before the rescue helicopters could extract them, their chances of survival would be almost zero. Chen was working frantically to prepare Martinez for immediate evacuation. Despite his improved condition, he was still too weak to walk unassisted and would need to be carried to any rescue aircraft. Parker, his head injury finally allowing him to think clearly again, had positioned himself to help with Martinez while watching for enemy soldiers who might approach the cave from unexpected directions. The radio crackled with urgent communications between the rescue aircraft and their base. Sarah could hear the helicopter pilots coordinating their approach and discussing the tactical situation. Enemy forces had been detected throughout the area, and the rescue would have to be conducted under hostile fire. The pilots were requesting immediate air support to suppress enemy positions during the extraction. Sarah looked out from the cave entrance and saw the first enemy soldiers reaching the lower levels of their rocky hideout. The soldiers were moving carefully, checking each potential hiding place as they worked their way up toward the cave system. She estimated that they had perhaps 5 minutes before the enemy troops would discover the cave entrances and force a direct confrontation. The rescue helicopters appeared over the ridgeline, flying fast and low to avoid enemy fire from the valley below. Sarah could see that there were 2 aircraft, one configured for medical evacuation and another that appeared to be a gunship providing escort protection. The helicopters immediately came under fire from enemy positions, and Sarah watched tracer rounds streaking across the sky as the aircraft maneuvered to avoid the ground-based weapons. The Kyo medical evacuation helicopter began searching for a suitable landing zone near the cave system, but the rocky terrain made it impossible to land close to their position. The pilot's voice came over the radio, explaining that they would have to rappel down to extract the survivors, or Sarah's team would have to move to a more open area where the helicopter could land safely. Moving Martinez to an open landing zone would expose them to enemy fire and take time they didn't have. Sarah made the decision to request a rappel extraction, knowing that it would be more dangerous for the rescue crew but offered their best chance of getting everyone out alive. She gave the helicopter pilot their exact coordinates and began preparing Martinez for what would be a difficult and dangerous evacuation. The enemy soldiers were getting closer. Sarah could hear their voices echoing through the rock formations as they communicated with each other and coordinated their search. She positioned herself where she could see the main approach to their cave while still being able to help with the evacuation. When the rescue helicopter arrived, the escort gunship began attacking enemy positions in the valley, trying to suppress the ground fire that was targeting the medical helicopter. The sound of cannon fire and rocket explosions echoed across the rocky landscape as the gunship worked to clear a path for the evacuation. Enemy forces responded with increased intensity, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple locations as the firefight escalated. The medical helicopter moved into position directly above their cave system and began lowering rescue personnel on ropes. Sarah could see 2 figures in military uniforms descending toward their position, carrying additional medical equipment and evacuation gear. The helicopter crew was clearly experienced and professional, but they were operating in extremely dangerous conditions with enemy soldiers approaching from multiple directions. Just as the rescue team reached the ground near their cave entrance, the first enemy soldiers appeared among the rocks about 50 meters below their position. Sarah aimed her pistol and fired warning shots to discourage their advance, while shouting to Parker and Chen that the enemy had found them. The rescue team immediately took defensive positions and began returning fire with more effective weapons. Chen quickly briefed the rescue medics on Martinez's condition while they prepared him for the rope evacuation. The medical team had brought a special harness system that would allow them to lift Martinez safely despite his injuries, but the process would take several minutes to complete properly. During those critical minutes, Sarah and the rescue team would have to hold off the advancing enemy soldiers. The gunfight intensified as more enemy troops reached the rocky area around the cave system. The rescue team had better training and equipment, but they were outnumbered and fighting from an exposed position. The escort gunship continued providing fire support, but the rocky terrain limited its effectiveness, and the enemy soldiers were using the natural cover skillfully. Parker, despite his ongoing recovery from the concussion, proved to be an effective fighter. He had found additional ammunition in the rescue team's equipment and was helping to cover one of the approaches to their position. Chen finished her medical preparations and took up a defensive position, while the rescue medics worked to secure Martinez in the evacuation harness. The enemy soldiers made several attempts to rush their position, but were driven back each time by coordinated fire from the defenders. However, Sarah could see that the enemy forces were trying to surround their position and would eventually succeed if the evacuation took much longer. The rescue helicopter was running low on fuel and would have to leave soon regardless of whether the extraction was complete. The rescue team leader made the decision to begin the evacuation immediately, even though Martinez wasn't fully secured in the optimal position. They began lifting him toward the helicopter while continuing to fight off the enemy attack. Parker would go up next, followed by Chen, with Sarah and the rescue team providing cover until everyone else was safely aboard the aircraft. As Martinez was pulled up toward the rescue helicopter, enemy soldiers made their most determined assault on the cave position. Sarah found herself in a desperate firefight, using her last magazine of ammunition to help the rescue team hold their defensive line. The sound of gunfire was constant, and bullets were hitting the rocks around their position regularly. The extraction was succeeding, but it was going to be very close. Enemy reinforcements were arriving in the valley below, and the rescue helicopter was taking increasing amounts of ground fire. Sarah knew that within minutes, their position would be overrun or the rescue helicopter would be forced to withdraw to avoid being shot down. Everything depended on the next few critical minutes as the evacuation continued under increasingly desperate circumstances. In the rocky wilderness of the neutral zone, the rope evacuation continued with Martinez safely aboard the rescue helicopter, but the enemy assault was intensifying with each passing second. Parker was next in line for extraction, and the rescue team was preparing to lift him when a concentrated burst of enemy fire forced everyone to take cover behind the largest rocks near the cave entrance. The helicopter pilot was struggling to maintain position as tracer rounds passed dangerously close to the aircraft's main rotor. Sarah realized that their defensive position was becoming untenable. Enemy soldiers had reached multiple elevated positions around their rocky sanctuary and were beginning to coordinate crossfire that would soon make the evacuation impossible. She made a critical decision that would determine the outcome of their rescue, calling for the helicopter to withdraw temporarily while she and the rescue team dealt with the immediate threat. The helicopter pilot initially refused to leave without completing the evacuation, but Sarah convinced him that staying in position would result in the aircraft being shot down and everyone being killed or captured. The rescue team leader agreed with Sarah's assessment and ordered the helicopter to pull back to a safer distance while maintaining radio contact for immediate return when the situation permitted. With the helicopter temporarily gone, Sarah and the rescue team could focus entirely on fighting off the enemy assault. The rescue team consisted of 2 Navy SEALs who had volunteered for the dangerous extraction mission, and their combat experience immediately became apparent. They moved with precision and efficiency, using advanced tactics and superior firepower to neutralize enemy positions one by one. The senior SEAL, who identified himself as Chief Petty Officer Williams, quickly assessed their tactical situation and developed a plan to break the enemy encirclement, while his partner, Petty Officer Rodriguez, provided suppressive fire. Williams moved to a flanking position that would allow him to attack the enemy soldiers from an unexpected direction. Sarah and Parker were assigned to hold the central position and prevent enemy forces from overrunning their defensive line. Chen continued providing medical support, treating minor wounds that several team members had sustained during the firefight, and monitoring Martinez's condition via radio communication with the medical helicopter crew. Her calm professionalism under extreme pressure helped keep everyone focused on their individual responsibilities during the chaotic battle. The SEAL team's tactical expertise began to turn the tide of the engagement. Williams successfully flanked the largest group of enemy soldiers and eliminated several of them with precision rifle fire, while Rodriguez used his heavy weapons to suppress other enemy positions. The coordinated attack disrupted the enemy assault and bought valuable time for the evacuation to resume. However, the radio intercepts indicated that enemy reinforcements were arriving rapidly. Vehicle convoys were approaching from multiple directions, and additional enemy aircraft had been dispatched to the area. The rescue team would have a very limited window to complete the evacuation before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Chief Williams called for immediate extraction support and coordinated with the helicopter pilot to resume the evacuation. The medical helicopter returned to position above their rocky fortress, while the escort gunship intensified its attacks on enemy reinforcements approaching through the valley. The sound of rotor blades overhead, mixed with the constant crack of rifle fire and the deeper rumble of explosive ordnance as the battle reached its peak intensity. Parker was quickly hoisted up to the helicopter despite the ongoing firefight. His evacuation went smoothly, and he was safely aboard within 2 minutes. Chen was next, but just as the rescue harness was being lowered for her, a new group of enemy soldiers appeared on the ridgeline above their position and began firing down into their defensive area with devastating accuracy. Rodriguez immediately shifted his fire to engage the new threat, but the elevated enemy position gave them a significant tactical advantage. Bullets were hitting all around the cave entrance, and Sarah realized that Chen would be completely exposed during her evacuation. She made the difficult decision to delay Chen's extraction until the ridgeline threat could be neutralized. Williams and Rodriguez worked together to assault the enemy position on the ridge. Using smoke grenades to conceal their movement, Williams began climbing toward the enemy soldiers while Rodriguez provided covering fire from below. Sarah contributed by using her knowledge of the local terrain to guide Williams along the safest approach route to the enemy position. The assault on the ridgeline was successful, but it took precious time that they couldn't afford to lose. Enemy vehicle convoys were now visible in the valley below, and radio intercepts indicated that enemy aircraft would arrive within minutes. The rescue helicopter was running critically low on fuel and would soon be forced to withdraw regardless of whether the evacuation was complete. Chen's extraction began immediately after the ridgeline was secured. She was quickly pulled up to the helicopter, while Williams and Rodriguez maintained defensive positions to prevent any additional enemy interference. Sarah watched with relief as Chen disappeared into the aircraft, knowing that her friend and teammate was finally safe after their week-long ordeal in the neutral zone. Now only Sarah and the 2 SEALs remained on the ground, facing an increasingly desperate situation. Enemy vehicles had reached the base of their rocky position, and soldiers were dismounting to begin a final assault. The escort gunship was running, low on ammunition and fuel, and the medical helicopter needed to depart immediately to avoid being shot down by the approaching enemy aircraft. Williams made the decision that Sarah had been dreading. The helicopter would have to leave with the rescued personnel, while he, Rodriguez, and Sarah would attempt to escape and evade on foot until additional rescue forces could be organized. It was a dangerous plan with low chances of success, but it was the only option that wouldn't result in the loss of the rescue helicopter and everyone aboard. Sarah accepted the decision without argument, knowing that Williams was right about the tactical realities they faced. The helicopter departed with Martinez, Parker, and Chen safely aboard, while Sarah and the 2 SEALs prepared for what would essentially be a fighting withdrawal through hostile territory filled with enemy forces specifically hunting for them. The 3 remaining team members gathered their equipment and prepared to move out from their rocky sanctuary. Williams had additional weapons and ammunition that would give them a better chance during the escape attempt, and Rodriguez carried advanced communication equipment that would allow them to coordinate with friendly forces for eventual extraction. Sarah took one last look at the cave system that had sheltered her team for a week, and at the grave marker for Anderson, who would have to be left behind. She felt a mixture of grief for their lost teammate and relief that most of her people had been successfully rescued. Now she faced a new challenge, escaping through the neutral zone with 2 elite warriors who had risked their lives to save her team. The sound of enemy soldiers climbing through the rocks below indicated that they had very little time before their position would be overrun. Williams signaled for immediate movement, and the 3 survivors began their dangerous journey away from the cave system that had been both sanctuary and prison during their desperate fight for survival. Behind them, enemy forces secured the area and began their own search for the remaining survivors, unaware that their quarry was already moving through the rocky wilderness toward an uncertain but hopeful future.